Peace and blessings, dear FBA family and friends, and I see some enemies. I am your brother and host, Dr. Muhammad, and these are the Dr. Muhammad Files. Welcome to another great episode of the Dr. Muhammad Files, where today will be the second part of a two-part research-driven podcast called the Freedmen Segment that uncovers the historical and modern struggles of foundational black Americans who are the descendants of freedmen and our fight for recognition and liberation. In part one, we discussed the broken promises of Reconstruction, Freedmen's Bureau Betrayal, systemic denial of reparations, and anti-Freedmen legislation such as the Black Codes, Jim Crow, and Convict Leasing. In part two, we will discuss reparations and policy manipulation, the way forward, organizing for foundational black American liberation, and we'll wrap it up with a conclusion and call to action. So let's get started.
Brothers and sisters and friends, and I see some enemies. In fact, I think we'd be fooling ourselves if we had an audience this large and didn't realize that there were some enemies present. In fact, I'm a black nationalist freedom fighter. The political philosophy of black nationalism only means that the black man should control the politics and the politicians in his own community. The time when white people can come in our community and get us to vote for them so that they can be our political leaders and tell us what to do and what not to do is long gone. By the same token, the time when that same white man, knowing that your eyes are too far open, can send another Negro into the community, get you and me to support him so he can use him to lead us astray, those days are long gone.
All right, I want to first give a shout out to my son Tariq for that beautiful intro and the collab on the pics. I also want to shout out our dear brother Tariq Nasheed for the throwback uh, cap, FBA cap, and FBA hoodie. All right, so the fight for reparations. The case for reparations for foundational black Americans who are the descendants of freedmen is rooted in legal, political, and economic frameworks that validate direct compensation for slavery, a debt that is owed. So, from a legal standpoint, there's precedence for reparations through cases like Japanese American redress for World War II internment and the Jewish Holocaust restitution, which America had nothing to do with that. So, despite this, FBA claims are consistently met with resistance. Politically, reparations have been diluted into vague racial equity policies that fail to center the unique historical grievances of foundational black American descendants for compensation of slavery, right? They give all of these initiatives and programs that are pretended to be a form of reparations, but actually benefit every other group. DEI, in my study, I showed that DEI does not benefit foundational black American male faculty at predominantly white institutions of higher learning. Affirmative action as well does not. Actually, affirmative action was a form of compensation for slavery. It was initially intended for that, but guess who benefited the most from affirmative action? And the studies show this: white women. So, historical agreements of FBA descendants for compensation of slavery are met with initiatives and programs that do not address compensation. Economically, the racial wealth gap due to slavery was exacerbated by discriminatory policies such as redlining, predatory lending, and employment discrimination. This demonstrates the necessity of reparative justice. Direct compensation through the form of lineage-based cash payments, then land grants, business funding, and tax-exempt status for foundational Black American descendants, it remains central to genuine reparations or reparative justice. Yet, despite knowing this, the politicians, they know they don't need another study. Yeah, right? Yet these measures are often disregarded in favor of symbolic gestures and performative politics. I talked about performative acts in my last podcast. They give us symbolic gestures. Oh, you know what? We'll give you Juneteenth, right? We'll let you celebrate Juneteenth. When we've been celebrating Juneteenth, I was out in Texas in the late 90s, late 80s, early 90s, and the Texans were celebrating Juneteenth back then. We didn't need that symbolic gesture, right? They give us all this symbolic and performative gestures that mean nothing. They also have immigration policies and bring in immigrant buffer classes. What do I mean by that? So the immigration policies have long been manipulated to displace foundational Black American descendants of freedmen in political and economic spaces. Historically, let's put this into context. Historically, immigration laws favored non-Black Europeans while restricting African and Caribbean immigrants. It was foundational Black Americans who said, wait a minute, why are you bringing in all these non-Black Europeans and you're not bringing in African and Caribbean immigrants, right? We said, no. We thought that we were going to have some allyship with the African and Caribbeans. Little did we know that they're totally against foundational Black Americans, right? Let's not even beat around the bush anymore. Let's just say what it is. So in recent decades, however, an influx of Black immigrants due to foundational Black Americans fighting for them to be here they've been strategically positioned as a buffer class, weaponized to neutralize foundational Black Americans' political power and undercut specific reparations demands. That's why you see some of these Black people, they're like these melanated people, right? Because a lot of them say, I'm not Black. Don't call me Black. I'm Nigerian, right? So in other words, they don't want to be associated with foundational Black Americans unless it benefits them, right? So many recent arrivals, while racially Black, they identify as other. Which is fine, which is okay. We just didn't, and the foundational Black American community, we did not know that that's how they felt. So now we're saying, okay, you're right. You do have a different experiences. You do have a different lineage, right? We're not the same. So while many melanated people are racially Black, they don't share the same lineage-based grievances against the United States government, but they're often used to dilute foundational Black American-led movements for reparations. That's why you see these melanated people get on TV and they're like, "Oh, I'm against reparations." You're like, "Wait a minute, who is that?" And then you come to find out that those people have immigrant backgrounds, and that's why they're against reparations. They have no claim, right? They're not against scholarships that are foundational Black American based, right, at these HBCUs because they can benefit from them. We had one lady on TikTok and she said, "Oh, I come here. When melanated people from Africa and the Caribbean come here, we come to take. We don't come for anything else. We see how much we can take, and we take y'all scholarships and we do everything, and then we distance ourselves from her. So, furthermore, institutions they actively promote the elevation of immigrant melanated individuals over foundational black Americans in academia. I demonstrated this in my study suggests that this was true. Also in media and business, further marginalizing FBA voices and priorities. You can see it in the media. You see all of these melanated people from Africa and Caribbean, the Caribbean, playing roles of foundational black Americans. Then when it comes time for them to get an award, they say, shout out Nigeria, shout out Kenya. You're like, whoa, wait, what? You just played an FBA role, which is, there's nothing, let's get this straight. There's nothing wrong with shouting out where you're from. But when it comes to foundational black Americans, we're told, hey, you can't be black American. You can't be a foundational black American. That's being divisive, right? And so we're saying, no, that's not being divisive. And also when we go to play, if we play an African role, they say, oh, why didn't you get an African, right? But yet they're allowed to play foundational black American roles. So this manufactured competition, it ensures that discussions around foundational black Americans progress become more about diversity optics. I call it the illusion of inclusion. It becomes more about diversity optics than addressing systemic anti-foundational black American racism, right? So federal versus state level resistance. A major barrier to reparations is the deliberate political sidelining of foundational black American specific justice claims for slavery. At the federal level, politicians strategically lump reparations discussions into a broader racial equity initiatives. So in other words, they all lives matter the reparations claim. Oh, reparations should be for racism. No. Reparations is not for racism. Let's be clear. Reparations are for slavery. A debt owed. Nothing more, nothing less. We can talk about initiatives and programs for anti-black racism. That's fine. But reparations, lineage-based reparations, are for foundational black Americans who are the descendants of slavery. So these watered down approaches, they render reparations meaningless as they include other racial minorities, immigrants, and disadvantaged groups who do not share the same historical harms from slavery. And they weren't, they don't, they're not owed reparations. They weren't here. They're not lineage. Their lineage is not from here. So meanwhile, state and local efforts for reparations, such as those in California and Illinois, and Gavin Newsom is let's say he's not a friend of foundational black Americans. Let's just say that. I don't want this podcast flagged. But he is an anti-foundational black American. He is against reparations. He showed that, and we will not support him for governorship or for president of the United States for sure. So these reparation efforts, like in California and Illinois, they often result in complex bureaucratic studies rather than actionable policies. They always say, oh, let's do this study, we'll get this study, and then like in California, they say, oh, yeah, we're not even going to take it up for a vote, right? And these were done by black Democrats and Gavin Newsom. So additionally, resistance at the federal level ensures that even successful state level initiatives face legal and funding rollbacks. So even if they do get state level initiatives, the federal level ensures that we do not receive any form of compensation. So politicians across both major parties, not just the Democrats, the Republicans also, they're anti-foundational black Americans, especially when it comes to reparative justice for slavery. They don't even want to talk about it. They're now putting up bills to say we can never ever get reparative justice for slavery. This is the Republican Party. So we do not rock with the Democrats or the Republicans. We, FBA, are now on tangibles. What are you going to give to foundational black Americans? We don't want this kumbaya, oh, let's all lives matter it. No. Reparations are due to foundational black Americans, and we coming to get our check. We are coming to get the check. So the fight for direct foundational black American reparations remain an uphill battle against a system designed to deflect. Hey, look over there. Hey, look over there. Look over there. It's co-opted and it neutralizes legitimate demands for justice. But in the great words of our brother, Dr. King, we are coming to get our check. The economic disparities we see today didn't happen by accident. The United States government systematically ensured that wealth generating resources like land, business opportunities, and financial support were overwhelmingly reserved for who? White Americans, while foundational black American descendants of freedmen were deliberately excluded. This historical exclusion wasn't just about personal racism, it was structural and reinforced through legal and economic policies that benefited one group while oppressing another. So, to understand the extent of this economic manipulation, let's look at what Dr. Joe Fegan says in his piece, Systemic Racism, A Theory of Oppression. So he says, historically and in the present, the routine operation of the economy has greatly favored many millions of white Americans. Before the late 1960s, the many wealth generating resources provided by state and federal governments to United States citizens were overwhelmingly or exclusively for whites. Indeed, prior to the end of slavery in 1865, African Americans, he uses the misnomer African Americans, he's still late on updating his terminology. African Americans were not regarded by most whites, including the Supreme Court, as citizens, and thus very few had any access to wealth generating resources such as the public lands provided by state and federal governments to many white citizens. Right? So this excerpt, family, friends, and enemies, I want you to understand this. This excerpt is critical because it exposes how economic policies in the United States has never been race neutral, right? The right would always says, let's be race neutral. Well, the economic policies in America has never, listen, never been race neutral. Wealth was distributed primarily to white Americans, while foundational black American descendants of freedmen were denied access to these same opportunities. This wealth gap was intentionally created, and it continues to be reinforced through modern policy manipulation. So instead of addressing this historical economic theft through direct reparative justice through the form of lineage-based reparations, politicians use policy loopholes to sideline foundational black American demands. One of their primary tactics is to shift the conversation from lineage-based reparations to broader racial equity initiative programs that fail to target the specific harms inflicted on foundational black American communities stemming from slavery. Meanwhile, immigration policies have been leveraged to create an economic and political buffer classes that further undermines FBA claims to resources and political power. The reality is this, FBA family, friends, and enemies. I want you all to listen. Reparations are not just about helping foundational black American descendants of freedmen. They are about repaying a historical debt. If the government, listen to this question or statement, if the government had the power to create wealth, exclusively for white Americans, and historically you can't deny this fact, it has the power to compensate those from whom the wealth was stolen. So the fight for reparations is not just about addressing past injustices. It's about recognizing the calculated systemic denial of wealth to foundational black American communities during slavery and shortly thereafter. From the post-Civil War era to the present, we see a pattern of government-backed resources distribution that prioritizes white wealth accumulation while blocking foundational black Americans from those same opportunities. This isn't accidental. It's a deliberate design of systemic racism. Dr. Fegan says, after the Civil War, African Americans, I cringe every time I hear that terminology being used, African Americans freed from slavery were for the most part barred from new government provided resources such as good land for homesteading. Homesteading, and I preach this all the time, I teach this all the time, I should say. Homesteading, getting land, is one of the best ways to pass on generational wealth. By the rapidly expanding and violent Klan type organizations and by whites implementing racial segregation. Strikingly, in the peak decades of the official segregation era in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the United States government provided huge amounts of wealth generating resources to many white families and businesses. The federal government distributed hundreds of millions of acres of land, billions of dollars in mineral and oil rights, major airline routes, major radio and television frequencies, and many other government controlled resources, almost exclusively to white Americans, while black and other non-European Americans were mostly excluded by racial violence or the racial apartheid system of the era. So Dr. Fegan makes it clear. Wealth distribution in America has always been racialized. White Americans were granted land, mineral rights, business opportunities, and media access resources that allowed them to build generational wealth, while foundational black American descendants of freedmen were locked out through racial violence and government-backed exclusion. This, listen to me, FBA family, the reason why I read this particular excerpt, because this historical theft is the foundations of our reparations claim. Slavery and the taking of our land is the basis of our reparations claim. But here's where policy manipulation comes in. Instead of acknowledging and correcting this theft, that's what it is. Let's call it what it is. It was theft. Because remember, I talked about in my last podcast, the 40 acres in a Mule, where some land was actually given to freedmen, but after Lincoln's assassination, it was taken back. Also, there's many cases, hundreds and thousands of cases where land, despite not being compensated, we started to develop our own communities and land was taken from us. So modern politicians deflect the reparations conversation by lumping it into broader racial equity initiatives that, as we said before, these programs fail to specifically address the centuries of systemic theft from FBA communities and the main claim of reparations, which is slavery. And how do they do this? Immigration policies have been used to create an economic and political buffer class, one that benefits from diversity initiatives, that immigrants, I should say, benefit from diversity initiatives, while foundational black American Descendants of freemen remain where? At the bottom of the wealth and political hierarchy intentionally. This is why the fight for lineage-based reparations is so crucial. The United States government has a long history of distributing resources, but only to selected group. For example, right now, who's the selected group that they're distributing the resources to? Illegal aliens. No matter what side of the political spectrum you're on, you can't deny that the United States government is distributing resources to those who came into our country illegally while denying us our claim for reparations. Our demand is simple. The same government that enriched white families for generations must now rectify its exclusionary policies by providing direct compensation to the very people it systemically disenfranchised. Anything less is another continuation of systemic theft. One of the biggest myths about wealth in America is that it was built purely through hard work and individual effort, and that immigrants built the country. This is not true. Foundational Black Americans are not immigrants. We did not immigrate here. In fact, I said this in my last podcast. We are the only non-immigrant group. In reality, generational wealth for white Americans was largely created through government policies that provided land, financial resources, and economic opportunities, while systemically excluding FBA descendants of freedmen. This isn't just about past injustices, right, family? It's about how those policies shape the economic realities we see today. It's not about a handout. It's about reparative justice. So let's take a closer look at how this played out through the Homestead Act, one of the most significant wealth generating policies that we talked about a few seconds ago. Let's go a little bit deeper. As Dr. Fegan explains it, he says, let us briefly consider systemic racism as it operates in just one historical period of the U.S. economy. Under the Federal Homestead Act passed in the 1860s and in effect until the 1930s, the U.S. government provided about 246 million acres of land, much of it taken from Native Americans by force or chicanery. Now, I'm going to give another podcast on Black Native Americans because that was part of Foundational Black Americans ethnogenesis. I'm going to give a podcast specifically for that. But Native Americans weren't just the red ones or the $5 Native Americans. The $5 Indians is what they called them because Europeans would pay $5 to be put on the Indian roll. We'll talk about the DOS rolls and Black and Native Americans in a different episode. But I digress. At low or no cost for about 1.5 million farm homesteads because of the extensive racial exclusion and violence directed at African Americans, including those recently freed from slavery. Those who gained access to these wealth generating resources were almost entirely white. The homesteads of about 160 to 320 acres provided land resources on which many white families, including new European immigrant families, built up substantial wealth in the initial generation and subsequent generation. So a lot of people, you have to contextualize it. I have 1 acre of land is like a football field. I have about 4 acres of land. So this is substantial amount of land. I can barely keep up with it, right? And so just passing this on to further generations creates generational wealth. I can't express enough how important generational wealth is passed down through land. This is another reason why we are owed reparative justice, because during slavery and right thereafter, generational wealth was created by whites while freedmen were excluded from generating wealth through the process of land allocation, I should say. Wrapping up Dr. Fegan's piece that supports our reparations claim, he says these white control programs of land provisions have had major long term consequences. Drawing on demographic projections, one researcher carefully data analysis suggests that perhaps 46 million white Americans are the current descendants of the fortunate homestead families and are substantially inheritors and beneficiaries of this wealth generating government program. In addition, many millions more white Americans are the current descendants of those whites who receive millions of acres of public land allocated by the government to provide companies for farms before the 1860s. Even though they may not be aware of it, many white families today are comfortable or affluent because of these past and vast federal giveaways. So, this passage, dear FBA family, friends, and enemies, it exposed a critical reality. Federal policies directly enrich white families while systemically locking out foundational black American descendants of freedmen. The land provided under the Homestead Act became the foundation of generational wealth, passing down economic stability to white Americans for over a century. According to Dr. Fegan's analysis, about 46 million white Americans today are descendants of these homestead families, meaning they continue to benefit from these racialized wealth transfers. Even if they don't realize it, they still benefit from it. You always hear people say, "Oh, I worked so my family came here with nothing." That's not true. If you came here for nothing, you were given something. Meanwhile, the same government that had the power to distribute wealth to white Americans now pretends that reparations for FBA descendants it's too complex or unfeasible, right? You always hear this argument, well, how are you going to pay for it? They didn't say that when they were giving away hundreds of billions of dollars to other groups of people. So instead of addressing these direct harms, politicians they manipulate policy by diluting reparations demands into broad racial equity programs that again fail to provide targeted compensation for slavery. On top of that, immigration policies have been strategically used to create a buffer class that further dilutes foundational black American political and economic influence. So the fight for reparations, it isn't about charity. Oh, you hear people say, "Oh, just get out and work. You guys are asking for a handout." Reparations is about reparative justice. If the United States government can provide 246 million acres of land to white Americans, it certainly has the capacity to compensate the descendants of freedmen of those who were intentionally excluded, those who built the country with free labor and their lives. So FBA family, friends, and enemies, how do we go forward? How do we progress? So to secure long-term progress, it is essential to develop independent foundational black American-led institutions that serve the interests of foundational black American descendants. This includes, I would recommend that we first establish the Freedmen's Bureau again. And I talked about this earlier in an earlier podcast. Set up the Freedmen Bureau first. Set up independent schools, take back our HBCUs, and research centers that prioritize accurate historical education and cultural preservation. We must gatekeep the culture as well. If we don't delineate and gatekeep the culture, it other groups will superimpose their culture over ours and we will be erased through ethno-melanism. So FBA owned institutions would provide an alternative to the predominantly white educational structures that have historically excluded or misrepresented Black American history and made it about African history, not Black American history, because we are the culture and history here. Additionally, funding and endowments for foundational Black American research should research centers can if we establish the FBA research centers, it can ensure that critical scholarship like my scholarship and others, Tariq Nasheed, Black Alpha Network, Professor Black Truth, and all of our brother Dr. Johnson, all of this foundational Black American scholarship on FBA lineage, reparations, and systemic oppression can remain at the forefront of academic and policy discussions. So also economic and political strategies. We have to develop economic and political strategies. Foundational Black American family, friends, and enemies. We're going to establish economic and political strategies. Economic self-sufficiency is key to foundational Black American empowerment. So encouraging entrepreneurship, cooperative economics, and community investment will reduce reliance on institutions that have historically worked against FBA interests. You have all these other groups who come into our communities. You have the Indians, you have Arabs, all of these other groups. And before even those groups, you had the Irish, the Italian, the Jewish community. They would come into Black neighborhoods, set up their institutions, extract all the resources, and then build up their communities, right? And so we have to do cooperative economics, right? Dr. Claude Anderson, our dear brother, has gave us the blueprint. Elijah Muhammad has gave us the blueprint on cooperative economics, right? So this includes supporting FBA-owned businesses, creating financial cooperatives, and developing venture capital networks to fund foundational Black American startups. Politically, a focused strategy on legislative advocacy is necessary, mandatory to push for specific policies that benefit foundational Black American descendants of freedmen, including, and most importantly, reparations. Also, land ownership programs and legal protections against economic discrimination. And also, we have to protect against, once we do get reparations, because we're going to get reparations, ensure that they don't firebomb us like they did Tulsa, Oklahoma, right? We have to develop our own police institutions, our own, like the Native Americans. They have their own police forces, right? So building coalitions with FBA-focused political action committees, we can develop PACs, can also strengthen lobbying efforts to influence policy decisions at the local, state, and federal levels. We also, FBA family, friends, and enemies, we have to reclaim our narrative. Controlling the narrative around foundational Black American history and culture and contributions is crucial in combating misinformation and historical erasure. This requires investment in FBA-led media, publishing companies, and digital platforms to produce content that accurately reflects the FBA experience. And our dear brother Tariq Nasheed is doing an amazing job at doing this. Books, films, documentary, he's leading the charge. We can't only depend on Tariq Nasheed. We have to develop it further, right? He's setting the blueprint. He always talks about, Tariq Nasheed, that is, hey, don't just let me do it. What are you doing about it, right? And so we have to develop book, films, documentary, and independent news outlets that can serve as counter narratives to mainstream media distortions. We definitely can't depend on the Democratic machine. Definitely can't rely on, we can't depend on the Republican machine. And so, additionally, ensuring that foundational Black American scholars and historians have access to platforms where they can publish research and engage with the public will help sustain and authenticate historical records. So, by reclaiming control over storytelling, foundational Black American descendants of freedmen can ensure that our struggles, triumphs, and demands for justice remain central to public discourse. So, in conclusion, FBA family, friends, and always include the enemies lurking. As we close out this episode, let's reflect on the key discussions. Reparations and policy manipulation. So, the legal, political, and economic fight for direct compensation to foundational Black American descendants of freedmen, the role of the immigrant buffer class in undermining our political and economic influence, and how politicians they sideline reparations by lumping them into broader racial context initiatives. The way forward for liberation, the necessity of building FBA led institutions, fostering self sufficiency, engaging in strategic political advocacy. And I almost feel this is most important behind reparations. I believe that in order to get reparations, I think we should reclaim our narrative, who we are, delineation first, claiming our narrative through media, books, and research. The fight for foundational Black American justice and recognition is ongoing, and it requires a collective effort, strategic organization, and an unshakable commitment to our lineage and future. So, what's the call to action? The call to action, listen, FBA family and friends. I'm not one of the scholars who just talks about the problem. Most people at least have a superficial understanding of what the problem is. But then people always say, you always hear, well, what you going to do about it? What are you going to do about it? What are we doing about it? We should support FBA-led initiatives, invest in and contribute to FBA-owned businesses, educational institutions, and media platforms. We should we should look at doing business with foundational Black American owned businesses. Economic empowerment is key to sustaining our movement. We should also engage in research and advocacy. We should stay informed and share resources on reparations. When's the next reparations rally? I was there at the first reparations rally in D.C. In fact, one of the slides at the beginning is of my wife, and my son and daughter, my family, at the reparations rally. So we should share resources on reparations, political policies, and economic strategies that impact the foundational Black American communities. Knowledge is power, but applied knowledge is liberation. We should also concentrate on community building efforts. We should get involved in local and national organizations working to secure justice and economic stability for foundational Black American descendants of freedmen, whether through mentorship, financial support, or activism. Every effort contributes to our collective advancement. In fact, I have a nonprofit called BAFFLA, BAFFLA, Black American Freedmen, Future Leaders of America, BAFFLA. So we have some powerful discussions coming up, including conversations with leading scholars, activists, and policymakers. I'm going to start doing podcasts and having guest appearances. Hopefully, we can get our brother Tariq Nasheed, maybe Afro Elite, maybe Black Alpha Network, some of the hard-hitting scholars in the FBA Twitter streets, right? So stay tuned for deep dives into how grassroots movements are shifting the political landscapes for FBA descendants and much more. The fight for FBA recognition is far from over, but through education, activism, and self-determination, we will reclaim our rightful place in history. Our ancestors built this nation brick by brick, law by law, institution by institution. And now it is our duty to secure the justice, wealth, and legacy they were denied. The future of FBA empowerment is in our hands, and together, FBA family, friends, excluding the enemies, we will shape it. Stay tuned as we continue to uncover the truth and chart the path forward. Please like the podcast. Please hit that subscribe button down low. Share it. Comment below. Signing off. Your brother and host, Dr. Muhammad. And these are the Dr. Muhammad Files.